You are listening to Social Europe podcast. We discuss cutting-edge thinking on politics, economy, and employment and labour with some of the most thought-provoking people around, including Nobel Prize winners and other internationally acclaimed experts. So welcome and enjoy the conversation.
This episode of Social Europe podcast is brought to you by the Zaid Business School, University of Oxford. Maximize your effectiveness in the changing global business environment with the postgraduate Oxford Diploma in Global Business. Taught in 4 short modules over a year, the program is designed to accelerate your career and increase your impact while minimizing the disruption to your work and family life. Learn alongside senior executives from around the world and develop a lifelong network. Visit the Oxford Diploma in Global Business website to find out more. Hello everybody and welcome to Social Europe podcast episode 47. My name is Henning, Meyer, Editor-in-Chief of Social Europe. Today I'm in conversation with Danny Blanchflower, who is a Professor of Economics at Dartmouth University in the United States. And we talk about the aftermath of the financial and economic crisis, policy mistakes, and what can be done to avoid these mistakes in the future. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. So, Danny Blanchflower, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to me today about your most recent book. And you raised the question, we have all the good jobs gone. And I mean, if we start from, say, the economic and financial crisis of 2007, 2008, let's get started with this. Was it really a lightning bolt out of the blue, or could you really see it coming, but nobody really cared to look where looking was due?
I think it was pretty obvious by middle of 2007 that a major financial crisis was coming. Pretty obvious from the US housing market, slowing certainly by September 2007, looked very obvious. And I think it was pretty obvious by the spring of 2008 that the US, the UK, Europe, most of Europe were in recession. But what's really interesting was that central bankers before the event missed it. But what's, I think, more telling is once the event had happened, they still missed it. So if you look at the Fed, by its September 2008 meeting, just before Lehman Brothers failed, they still hadn't realized that the US had been in recession for 9 months. And every other European country was in recession as well. So that was obviously a big deal. The Bank of England didn't spot it. The ECB didn't spot it. So I think that was the crisis. People beforehand didn't see it. But I don't think we focused on the fact that after it had occurred, still people hadn't spotted it. And that is a big worry for today, which potentially we're sitting at another turning point, which probably central banks won't see for 9 months until 9 months after it's happened.
And if I remember correctly, you were a member of the Monetary Policy Committee at the time. And I mean, you had a first-hand insight into it. I mean, why was it that the central banks, whose job it is to monitor the economy and react in terms of monetary policy, how could they miss this?
I think it's very telling that central banks missed it. I started voting for rate cuts on my own in October 2007. And basically voted on my own, saying there was something horrible coming, that everything looked terrible, and nobody else kind of agreed with me. And basically what changed everything was the failure of Lehman in the middle of September 2008, and then really the failure of RBS at the start of October. The thing that's amazing to me is that people didn't see it. I made a speech in April 2008, which was posted on the Bank of England's website, where I said, America's in recession, the UK's in recession, what's everybody doing? And the only response was, well, you can't expect economists to spot recessions. And I argue that that's exactly what they should be doing. What's the point of having them otherwise?
And, when was it actually spotted? When there were literally the queues out of Northern Rock?
No. The queues for Northern Rock were in 2007 and everybody ignored those. Oh, right. I don't think they ignored that. That was a year earlier. I mean, the first time in 100 years, people had lined up outside banks. So actually, I don't think really people spotted it or realized what was going on until October the 7th, 2008, when RBS failed and 6 central banks in the world cut rates together the next day. And that was a pretty strong indicator that, the the global economy had collapsed. But the point of the story is that the global economy had collapsed 9 months earlier, and they didn't spot it. So that's what I think we should focus on today. I think it's very likely we're at a big turning point. Germany, Italy, the UK, China, looks like global manufacturing has gone into recession, and still central banks haven't really kind of reacted to it. Although Mario Draghi the other day said stimulus is coming, but I think the worry is 10 years later, we're probably making the same kinds of errors.
And interestingly, it doesn't look like all of the central banks got the severity of the situation. I mean, I remember the ECB raising rates, prematurely, very much so.
Not only did it raise rates, it raised rates twice in 2011. The Bank of Sweden raised rates as well. And Lars Svensson, the famous Princeton economist who was on that board and objected like I did, he quit. But yeah, I think the evidence is that any vote, let alone action, to raise rates since 2008 was clearly in error, and people have not understood that actually maybe the only data point we have is the Great Crash and the Great Depression. Think about what we saw in 1929. We saw the Great Crash, and Keynes warned about the long-dragging conditions of semi-slump. Well, then we repeat in 2007-8, and we enter the long-dragging conditions of semi-slump. And I think what economists haven't understood is that anything that happened between 1945 and 2008 probably tells us nothing. Really, what we have to do is look back to the Great Recession, the Great Depression. People say to me things like, in the Fed's last tightening cycle, and I say, well, what relevance has that got? Where have you ever had a data point where the ECB has got negative interest rates doing QE? The Bank of Japan, the same thing. It seems to me that the economists have got messed up with not realizing that every data point they had between 1945 and 2008 is probably irrelevant.
So basically, if I understand you correctly, you're sketching out two fundamental problems with the monetary policy economists. The first one is they say, well, it's not our job to spot the recessions.
Exactly.
And the second one is, because economics is literally based on, analyzing past data and just projecting it into the future. Right. If you look at the last few decades, the situation is so different. They're projecting the last few decades into the future doesn't tell you anything, really.
Right. I mean, I think that's right. But I think there's a third thing to add, which is that if we'd have spotted it, it wouldn't have made any difference. If we'd have spotted it a year and a half earlier and reacted, it wouldn't have made any difference, which I think is absolute abject nonsense. If you could have got in a year and a half earlier and realized that housing markets were collapsing around the world, there was a global recession coming. I mean, I think it's either. Well, I suppose it's sort of pathetic excuse for failure. But I mean, the worry for people listening to this podcast is, well, have these folks not learned anything? I mean, to actually say it's not the job of central banks to actually spot the greatest downturn in 100 years is utterly pathetic. But I guess that's all they can say because they missed it. So they have to sort of make excuses for missing the big one. So I think this is a sad reflection of economics and a big part of why people are so upset with the elites about the fact that, this crisis that hurt people was bad. And then many places around the world, not only did central banks, they cut rates, but then fiscal authorities found Keynes for 18 months and then went to austerity, which is why, we're looking at places in the UK where public spending in towns that voted Brexit has been cut by 40% or so. The number of police has been reduced enormously, crime's rising. So the combination of, a big shock and then the public sector doing exactly the opposite of what Keynes would have argued explains votes for Trump and Brexit and Le Pen and in Italy and elsewhere because the people are hurting. And then the central banks have the temerity to say, oh, look, everything's great. We're at full employment. Time to raise rates again, as the Fed did. And so here we go again. I mean, based upon zero evidence from the real world that it was time to raise rates. And now they're desperately having to cut them again because they made an error in increasing them.
Yeah, I mean, coming to the current, the current situation in a minute, but we talked about the recession and the global financial crisis of 2007, 2008, and why they were missed. But there's also something specific, peculiar about the so-called recovery, right? So exactly. That has been very unconventional too. So how would you characterize the recovery we've seen from this crisis?
Well, I think the best way to kind of characterize it is to look at the contrast between the words and the actions. I mean, George Osborne became Chancellor of the Exchequer in June 2010 and said that the way we're going to get lots of growth is to cut public spending. And in fact, he's put himself up as to hopefully be, he wants to be the new director of the IMF. I couldn't think of a worse person, and I'll explain why. So comes in, says the way to increase spending is to decrease spending. So what we're going to do is raise taxes and decrease capital spending and decrease investment. Well, and then tell everybody this is going to be great, make forecasts and say how great it was going to be. Well, it's clear now that he has been the worst chancellor in 300 years, generated the slowest recovery in 300 years. In 600, there have only been two worse ones. The next worst was the South Sea bubble, and the worst of all, 600 years ago, was the Black Death. So this recovery is basically the third worst of all time. And a chancellor saying how successful he's been, my response has been, well, you may think you're successful, but every other chancellor in the last 300 years has been more successful than you. You've been the most disastrous chancellor ever seen. And then says, I should be the person to take over the IMF. Well, foxes shouldn't control chicken houses, should they? I mean, so this has sort of been disastrous. It's been, and what we've seen in Europe, Draghi said the other day, it's very important going forward that the fiscal authorities stop countering everything that the monetary authorities are doing. Fiscal and monetary policy has to work together. It's worked against each other since 2010. It generated a great recovery from 2009 through 2010 because fiscal and monetary policy worked together. So I think fiscal policy has been a disaster. Central banks have held rates relatively low for a long time. Clearly, they couldn't raise rates. And now the question is, where are we going forward? And the worry is that the central banks don't have any tools to use.
And we're coming to the intersection between monetary and fiscal policy also, in a second part, because it's interesting. I think Draghi also said once, monetary policy in this climate with the refusal by most governments to use any fiscal levers is like pushing on a string, isn't it? So,
well, I think I can add a little bit to that. That's exactly right. And in fact, I think in the last week, the governor of the Bank of Australia said exactly the same thing. Cut rates from 1.25% to 1%. So Australia's been pretty successful, tied to China. But of course, as China slows, Australia's being impacted. And he said exactly the same thing. Excuse me. As Draghi, that you're going to have fiscal stimulus. We can't do this on our own.
And is the whole debate about negative interest rates and modern monetary theory and these sort of things, is that a sort of a show of desperation that, what can monetary policy do? Of
course it's a show of desperation. So actually what we should see is that Draghi is actually talking about cutting interest rates in the ECB, making them more negative. It's not moving them to negative. I mean, we don't know how low negative we can go. It's not clear in the US whether you actually can do negative rates, or in the UK. But the problem is that, in the US, that there is some room to cut. But the markets are pricing in 3 cuts by January, despite the fact that the Fed said they were going to raise rates. The UK is another one where there's very limited. So let's think about the UK. There's very limited ability to cut. It's at 0.75. But go back to the fiscal front. The UK doesn't have a credible government. It's not even clear that if Boris Johnson wins, he can actually form a government. The likelihood is that he'll immediately fire Philip Hammond, the Chancellor of the Exchequer. And the Chancellor of the Exchequer is supposed to appoint a new governor of the Bank of England by January to replace Carney. So they haven't got much room to cut on the monetary front. There's no Chancellor of the Exchequer, and who knows what the next governor of the Bank of England will be. So what we have is kind of populist chaos. I look back in 2008, there were at least weapons available, and you certainly would argue that there were credible governments around the world. Well, maybe now we've got none of those things.
And in Germany, we again have the discussion about the debt brake, which is in the constitution. I mean, it's clear that this is not a good idea at all. And last week, I think the German bonds were minus 4.4% for 10 years and 0.2% positive for 30 years.
I've been seeing people posting new mortgages that people have been taking out. Somebody from Denmark posted the mortgage they took out, and the interest rate was negative on the mortgage. So people taking negative. Well, I mean, the problem about that is that how do you stimulate more? You pay people more for taking out a mortgage. So this is obviously we're seriously at a dilemma point. Think about quantitative easing. Well, fine, we're going to do more quantitative easing, but what are we going to buy? I mean, the problem the Fed has, if none of people are aware, the Fed can only buy three things by the Congress. Tell them they can buy things that are federally insured. So that means mortgage-backed securities, treasuries, and actually short-run municipal bonds, which it's never bought. But it can't buy private sector bonds. It can't buy ETFs. It can't buy all the things that the ECB and the Bank of Japan are buying. So the problem for the US is, well, what are you going to do? And the problem particularly is to broaden things and compete with the ECB and the Bank of Japan. Congress has to give them permission. Well, that doesn't look like it's going to happen. So the worry is that no action, A, won't be taken, enough won't be taken, and it won't be taken quickly enough. So this is a worry.
And, the Fed is running out of assets it could buy, possibly. And
absolutely right. But even if it wants to buy things, I mean, I remember when I was on the Bank of England, we were literally told, when we started thinking about what could we buy, the economist said to us, in principle, you could buy anything. Right? I mean, there's arguments about whether you should do it. We worry about whether it's unmandated fiscal policy or whatever. But in fact, you could buy buildings and companies and anything. But the question is, what's the impact of that? What are the risks of doing that? What's the feed-through mechanism to boost the economy? And the answer is the textbooks in economics went to chapter 35, and now we're at chapter 51, which hasn't been written. We don't know. We have no idea about what to do. We have no idea about how to extricate ourselves from this situation. So the lost decade we've had is going to become a lost 2 decades, certainly.
And, if I remember correctly, given the purchase program of the ECB, a large percentage of Eurozone government bonds is already on the balance sheet of the
exactly.
ECB.
Well, and one of the, give you an even more bizarre one, the Fed is not able to buy US corporate bonds, but the Bank of England has been buying them. So the Bank of England bought 10 billion pounds of corporate bonds and decided to make a rule, which was if you made a significant contribution to the UK economy, whatever you want to call that, say you employ 500 people in the UK, then those bonds can be bought. So the Bank of England has been buying Walmart and McDonald's and American corporates. And how crazy is that? So the UK buys American corporates, but the Fed isn't and can't. So so the ECB can start buying American things. I mean, it's that kind of crazy. But it's driven, I think the problem has been the monetary folks have been blamed, where it's really the fiscal folks. I mean, it's really the fiscal folks who are to blame. In the UK, Osborne's been the person who caused this, essentially caused populism. But in Europe, obviously the Bundesbank and many people have been trying to prevent fiscal stimulus. And here we are in situations where in France and in Italy, well, we're basically starting a new downturn with the unemployment rate, about in double digits. Well, how good's that going to go? Guess what? People are objecting. There are riots in the streets in France. The Italians struggling to create a government, and this is as good as it gets. This is in the book I talk about. If this is so great, why is everybody hurting? So there's this conflict again between the elites and people on the streets. And I say central banks have not been doing what I call the economics of walking about, which is go out there and ask people how you're doing. And if you say everybody's doing great and the people say, no, we're not, you have a problem.
But I mean, if the goal is actually fiscal policy and central banks are in chapter 51 out of 35 in the textbook, I mean, how do you unblock this? I mean, some of the fundamentals seem to be disregarded. I mean, if in Germany government spending is basically by definition zero, all the domestic savings have to flow abroad, right? And and they do. So, but how do you unblock this? I mean, if I understand you correctly, the central banks are the wrong places.
It's a great question. But I mean, think about in a sense what the foundation of independent central banks was about. It was about, well, A, being independent because it's better than them not being independent. And that's a big issue in the US, where Trump is now talking about firing the governor of the Fed, but also go back to unblocking the way we do economics. I mean, much of economics that we've seen has been about the fact that in the 1970s, unions were really strong and they were able to generate huge wage rises, and we got lots of inflation. So here we have a whole process set up to deal with expanding, rising inflation, where the problem is actually exactly the opposite. We can't create any inflation. I mean, the Fed raises rates and says, we must raise rates because inflation is going to rise. And everybody said, but it's below the target, and you're raising rates to kill non-existent inflation. So it's a problem of the paradigms have shifted and changed. The world changed, I think, in 2008. And the problem is to unblock this past thinking. I mean, to target inflation when there isn't any doesn't make any sense. So I think we have to start to think about new thinking. And perhaps, and my book talks a lot about this, perhaps throw all that stuff aside and basically try to run these economies hot so that people can benefit and improve themselves and start to see rising wage growth and perhaps shift the balance. Because in a sense, what we've talked about is this whole balance hasn't worked for people, hasn't worked for ordinary people. I mean, go back to the UK case. What you've seen today is that real wages in the UK are 6% below what they were in February 2008. Well, that's what you've got to start to Don't tell everybody how great it is and how successful you've been. We're going to have to find a way to actually deliver real wage growth to ordinary people. And fiscal authorities have been reluctant to do it. Well, then let's try and get the unemployment rate down to 2.5. I mean, what we've seen in Germany, good example, unemployment rates have fallen down to about 3.1. No sign of wage explosion. Same in the UK, same in the US, same in the Netherlands. So I think that the whole model has to be, let's try and crank these economies, put the pedal to the metal, start to subsidize work, and get away from this nonsense, which is that inflation is going to explode. We have to do something about ordinary people.
I mean, in terms of fiscal policy, I think Paul de Grauwe got it right when he said, there is no fiscal constraint, there is an inflation constraint.
Yeah.
And that inflation constraint is pretty much absent at the moment.
Well, remember what Paul de Grauwe talked about is he said, I think he said it great. I love this. De Grauwe said what we're operating here are the economics of the Maginot Line, right? The line that didn't work. The economic policy of the past, not relevant to the present, right? I mean, I think that's where we are. So in a sense, the complaint against the elites was that they haven't adapted. I mean, think of forecasts that we've seen around the world for wage growth and for productivity. And it all says within 18 months, everything will be back to where it was in 2006. And they've said that every month for the last, 120. And that hasn't been true. And there's been no learning. And I think that's the big thing we have to think about, no learning, and people are hurting. And I think in a sense, the vote for Trump and the vote for Brexit, I mean, we created economic chaos because of the failure to understand how this new global economy works.
And, the main lever to get back to target inflation of 2% is effectively wage increases, isn't it?
Absolutely right. I mean, the thing people forget is the Phillips curve was initially written in wage change space, not price change space. So in a sense, that's exactly right. I think of if you've got under target inflation, the way to get to it is to boost wage growth. We started to see some rise as economies clearly were moving towards full employment. In the US, the series that I like is production and non-supervisory workers. And we got a number of 4% growth in January 2019. And everybody said, whoopee, here we go. And I said, well, let's wait. Let's look at the sustained thing. Every month since then, it's ticked down. The latest data on Friday, we're down to 2.7. So basically, even where we started to see things towards the end of last year, that's dissipated. So basically, we should be trying to crank the unemployment rate down. In Germany, it certainly appears that the narrow is nowhere near 3%, right? And there's evidence from in the past, certainly evidence from the UK and elsewhere, that you can get unemployment below 2. I mean, it's perfectly feasible. The world has changed. The global economy means that worker bargaining power is less, firms can move, people can move, and the ability of workers to bargain wages up is less. So I think we can run economies at much hotter, if you like, with much lower unemployment. And put it technically, the NERU is probably nearer to 2 than it is to 5 or 6 or 4. And the big deal around the world is as unemployment rates move from 6 to 5 to 4, basically nothing happened. So if 4 was the full employment rate of unemployment, we'd have expected things to happen. And they absolutely haven't. In Germany, the Netherlands, the UK, the US, basically nothing's happened much to wage growth.
And, how would you counter the two standard replies to, when somebody claims we need a higher and faster wage growth? The first one is productivity puzzle. In the UK, productivity is not really increasing, so we can't increase wages. And the second one is competitiveness. That's the key one that is always put forward here in Germany. If we increase our wages, we decrease our relative competitive position. And hence, we'll start to slow. How would you sort of counter these arguments?
Well, I think there's a lot of evidence, actually. If you pay people more, they get to be more productive. I mean, one of the big things that happened, remember the work by the late Alan Kruger with David Kahn. What we learned in that work was that as you raise the minimum wage and you raise the wage that people were being paid, a couple of things happened. Better people showed up, but also what happened was the quit rate fell. So people stayed longer. That meant that if you train somebody and they stay for 2 weeks, well, you train them and they stay for 2 years, the cost of that training can be spread over a longer time period. So I think there's a lot of evidence to suggest that tenure rates rise as you pay people more. There's more incentive for firms to invest in productive activities and for workers to see there's a connection to their employer and they're going to benefit. I think the big story now is, I've written a lot about this in the past, wages are impacted by outside conditions, but also by internal things, by the ability to pay. But I think what's happened is that even if there's a firms today have an ability to pay, they don't have a willingness to pay. And if the labour market was tight, they'd be forced to. And that makes the balance of power between workers and firms shift somewhat. But I think productivity is driven by capital spending, but also it comes from workers. Workers are often the source of positive productivity things. So a lack of competition, essentially this is a global market. It's not as if one of these countries has seen a big wage growth as the unemployment rates fall. I gave you all of the ones that have got unemployment rates under 4, which is Netherlands, Germany, the US, and the UK, and there's no wage growth in those places. So I don't buy that. And the other thing people say is, it's about to take off. And I've probably been on TV shows for the last 10 years where someone says, but inflation's coming, wage growth is coming, it's all going to happen tomorrow. And I go on each time, I said, but you said that to me the last 47 times in a row. So that's fine, but what's the fix? And the fix, in a sense, is if you don't do it, people are hurting. And look at the chaos in the UK right now, where it's not even clear. The two candidates, I call it, they're in fantasy economics.
And you're absolutely right. I think that the sequences is important. If you think about industrial policy, what comes first? What is the consequence of which? The first thing is skilled work. Then they develop technology, and that then together creates wealth. So it's not these new technologies are developed by skilled workers. They just don't fall from the sky.
Exactly right. And what we've seen, I think, the big fundamental we've seen is the collapse of good, long-lasting jobs which attach workers to firms. What we've seen are those jobs have gone away, especially for the less skilled. People feel a sense of insecurity and weakness and helplessness. And the big story that I've seen, which is as fundamental around the world, in Germany as well, across all these countries, is this huge rise in underemployment, which makes people really unhappy. And it's a new phenomenon, which is people would like to work more hours at the going wage than they can get. And I first started studying economics. There was a whole series of papers talking about employment functions and the way that we as economists think, a positive shock comes along. What will be the first thing you do? Well, you'd raise the hours of people, and then you'd bring in temporary workers, and then you'd hire permanent folks. Well, the easiest way, if you were close to full employment, the easiest thing you would do is just say to your workers, okay, you're working 30 hours a week. You'd like to work 10 more. Yes, right, well, do it. So that's a really big phenomenon. Workers are unhappy at that fact. But to believe that at full employment, all that stuff exists in Germany less than elsewhere. But to believe that means we're at full employment makes no sense at all. And workers are being kept on those contracts with less hours than they would like. Hence, they're hurting, unhappy, insecure, fear for the future. So the fear of unemployment is high. And there's the disconnect. The central bank in the US and the UK says we're at full employment. Well, I think that makes absolutely no sense. Have lots of these people saying, I'd like more hours because it's the simplest thing in the world. It's like turning on a tap. The firm can just go tomorrow, right? Work more tomorrow. And they don't.
And interestingly, if we come to the current situation, so we've talked about, how you should analyze the past, what were the past mistakes, and how these mistakes are actually still being made today. Right. So where would you see the global economy in 2019? You already hinted towards a few dark clouds on the horizon. So what would your assessment be today?
Well, yeah, I think obviously the slowing Chinese economy is a big concern. I think the data for manufacturing, especially in Germany and Italy, China and the UK, is particularly worrying. The PMIs for the UK especially are worrying. And obviously the spreading trade war. But I would say the worry that I've been particularly concerned about recently in the US is all the indicators of a housing market recession has occurred in 2006 and 2007 and now occurring in the US. So we've seen falling numbers of permits to build, falling new construction, slowing house price growth. Now construction spending is going negative. So it appears around the world that we have a manufacturing recession. We have a construction recession that appears to be spreading, construction stroke housing that appears to be spreading. And then services are just about holding flat. But in the UK, that's almost exactly what's happened. But overall, we're likely to see this week that Q2 output has gone negative. So my concern right now is that the global trade war, the Fed, especially in the US, the Fed completely in major error, raising interest rates at the wrong time. And then third, probably I'd put Brexit, not so much Brexit happening, but the timing of Brexit at the point at which the global economy is slowing and creating lots of uncertainty. So I see that. Looks like macro errors. And then back to what we talked about. People missed it. They don't have the tools to deal with it. And then down we go. And the worry is, could you get a response? And the other thing we haven't talked about is if we start to see more unpleasant data, which I'm sure we go into, how quickly would these authorities respond? The UK, almost impossible. The US, you can't get anything through the Congress at all. So you're back to the Fed. And obviously the pressure in the US is now from Donald Trump on Jay Powell saying you've got to cut rates. And the truth is probably, I think Trump's right. They shouldn't have raised rates and they should have cut them. But then the whole independence of the central bank is in question, and our ability to kind of contain the markets is in question. The issue particularly now is markets seem to have been pretty benign. They don't think anything terrible is coming. But in the US, as I said, they have there are 3 rate cuts built. So we're now talking in July. The markets have built in 3 rate cuts by January, which is completely different to what the Fed said it was going to do.
And of course, there is a catch-22. You already mentioned the sort of the line from bad policy mistakes to people are hurting, and obviously that creates a political backlash. But that political backlash creates a fragmentation in the political system, which makes it more difficult to take any sort of decisions.
Absolutely right. Makes it very difficult. I mean, and so think about the Fed. I mean, you argue that the Fed and the Bank of England should be independent. And the idea is that they should be independent because they're better than the alternatives. But maybe what we've talked about is huge errors by the ECB and by the Bank of England and the Fed. They missed the Great Recession. Maybe things would have been better without them being independent, full of these people. I mean, so that's brought the whole thing into question. I mean, the debate about the Fed should be independent, but the truth is the Fed should not have raised rates 7 times. Jay Powell voted for it. Now rates are too high, and maybe the Fed thinks we can't respond to Trump. because that'll threaten our independence. But the fact that you don't respond actually means that you're out of place and out of time. And so this, as you say, this threatens the whole credibility, and then as down we go. What's being delivered to the people who voted for Trump? What's being delivered in the UK for Brexit? I mean, people keep saying, you've got to deliver Brexit as if everything's going to be fine. But supposing you do leave on the 1st of November, well, chaos reigns. What's going to happen to the people in coal and steel towns who voted for a world being better? But nothing's can be delivered, and it's only going to get worse. So this is just the start of chaos, I think.
And well, at the beginning of this chaos, let's finish, with the same questions that I ask most people in this podcast. So, if you were a policymaker, and we've painted a quite gloomy picture here, let's say, how would you go about trying to avoid the worst effect? So, what would your top 3 priorities be?
Well, I think what we learned from 2008 was acting too soon, or acting soon, would have really been better. So sitting back and waiting for something horrible to appear in the data looks like an error. I would certainly be trying to say we need to have a coordinated response and plot out what it is we would actually do if the economy slowed. So the central bank has to start to say, so Bank of England, will you go, you're at 0.75. You have to say to people, are you prepared to go negative? How negative would you go? If you're going to go and do asset purchase, what are you going to buy? What are the effects of those things going to be? And particularly think about how to coordinate that policy with government. And that's obviously a big problem. We don't even know what the government is in the next 6 months, say, in these countries. So my policy view would be, I think we have to take account of the fact that the economy is slowing. You need to do something, do it soon. And the consequences of acting when you didn't need to act are much less than the consequences of not acting when you should have. So I would have said it's the classic, the old soccer player thing, get your retaliation in first. I think Draghi was basically, I was with Draghi. Draghi basically said it right, I think. We're going to stimulate, we're going to try and get ahead of the game. We're going to try and prevent this stuff coming, but realizing that we got ourselves into a mess and fiscal authorities are going to have to step up. In the UK, Mark Carney's taken a great deal of flack because he started to say these kinds of things, and various politicians accused him of being part of Project Fear. But I'm a big supporter of what he did. I think he was ahead of Project Reality. So I think as a policymaker, you just got to be real and say, this is what we know, it's what we don't know. Here are the consequences of what you've done. It's not a perfect world, but by not acting, this is what's going to happen. So I think it's about being credible, trying to face reality, but understanding that today the risks to the downside are much greater. Get real. I think you have to say, let's start to get real. Scrap all this nonsense we've talked for a decade, that everything's going to be great tomorrow, and get real.
And, do you see any chance of international coordination? There was this one brief moment when Gordon Brown had the G20 moment. It fell apart very quickly afterwards, right? But
Paul Krugman, I actually agree with Paul Krugman. He says he thought 2 people saved the world, which was actually Ben Bernanke because of the moves that he made eventually and led by the Fed, and Gordon Brown, who organized that G20 meeting, the global stimulus. What's interesting is Trump has stood very much against sort of multilateral moves, but actually the reality is that's what worked. So multilateral moves, when we're in a global, this is much more a global economy. We globally went down in 2008, and the chances are driven now by Trump's trade war goes to China, and China spreads to Germany and Australia and spreads elsewhere. So the issues are basically similar everywhere. It's not like we're faced with the same thing. So I agree with you. The chances of it maybe are even less than they were in 2008.
And interestingly, if you needed one symbol for how wrong-headed the mindset was, is that when Gordon Brown misspoke in Parliament and he said, we saved the world, he was laughed at.
And he basically did.
Yeah.
He basically did. There was yes. Absolutely. And I think that's right. It was if you look back, the stimulus really worked. In the UK, if you look for 5 quarters from Q2 08 to I think Q2 09, there was this deep recession, and then recovery came. And if you plot it, what you can see is that the rate of recovery was almost precisely the same speed of recovery we'd seen from previous recessions in the last 50 years. And then the Tory coalition came in 2010 June, imposed fiscal austerity, and basically that just went completely flat from that point on. So if we learn anything, it's that stimulus, A, worked, and B, you took Keynes away too soon, right? You should have just kept going. Should have just kept going with the stimulus. The question why we didn't is a very interesting. I mean, in some sense, the fact that we didn't explains Trump, explains Brexit. I mean, that's the rise of populism at that moment, because we forgot that financial crises are unique and they're hard to recover from. And maybe people wanted to do that. Maybe they knew it. Maybe they did it on purpose. But but essentially, people were hurt by those actions. So not only were real wages in the UK very much lower than in the past, same elsewhere, but public services were slashed. The swimming pool was closed. The library was closed. The help in your town was closed. Think of the coal town. The coal town, the social support mechanism in the coal town went, as well as the private sector jobs and the benefits that were available went. And what you delivered was a sense of hopelessness. And so then people listened to populists who gave them hope, but the reality is that they're not delivering anything. And at some point, people have to deliver. And the worry is, we look at the Gilets jaunes in France, and maybe the worry is that kind of thing will spread.
And now we might be at a cusp of maybe a different type of crisis, but an economic slowdown nevertheless, with a more fragmented political system that seems less capable of responding correctly, and with a mindset that is still stuck in recipes that didn't work out last time around and unlikely now.
Yeah, I mean, I have one other thought, which is in previous recessions in Europe, a lot of the time what we had was, say, 10% unemployment, and it was 10% long-term unemployment. But the story then was 90% of the people had decent wage growth and were never unemployed. 10% of the people were unemployed all the time. Now what we have with underemployment and so on is the hurt is spread around more. Right? So everybody's hurting. What we saw was out of work poverty, out of work insecurity. But now it's spread to everybody. And so people with this underemployment, so people simply can't rise up the occupational pyramid. They can't restore the standards of living their parents had. And so now it's hard to see how this surge of populism is stopped, or stopped simply anyway, or stopped in any short time period. I mean, just look at the UK. I mean, I was born there, brought up. I was there a couple of weeks ago. It's absolutely scary. The political system is completely broken down, and people are just saying, just fantasy. People just making stuff up. It just doesn't. People are very. My mum, 92-year-old mum, she tells me she's scared. She says, I've never been scared in the 92 years. She says, I'm scared of what's going on.
Yeah, well, I lived in London for 15 years until last year, and to be honest, moving back to Germany after that time, I can see a lot of the early signs here as well. So,
absolutely.
So the idea that Germany, because of its history and is immune, is wrong. It's clearly wrong. So,
well, actually, that the UK was immune is wrong, right? I would never have thought that we'd have seen this collapse of the collapse of the main political parties. The possible talk that Boris Johnson's talking about prorogating Parliament. For people who don't know what it means we'll not allow, because Parliament's against Brexit, so we won't allow Parliament to open, so it can't vote against Brexit. Well, the history of that is it was done once before. I think it was Charles I lost his head. You're literally going to talk about not allowing Parliament to open because you don't like what it's going to do. This is a parliamentary democracy. I've never heard of such a thing. I mean, to think that you would prevent Parliament from opening.
No, it's completely uncharted territory, and one should probably stress for some of the listeners who don't know the UK that much. The UK is the one country where Parliament is sovereign.
It's a parliamentary democracy, and the problem is that basically the nonsense that the two candidates for Tory party leadership have been spouting can't get through the House of Commons. They can't pass it through the House of Commons. They can't make it law. They can't get a Queen's speech passed through. So their fix, because you can't get Parliament to vote for you, is you close Parliament down. I mean, apparently Putin says this is almost exactly what happens in Russia. You get 100,000 people to vote for it, and then if you don't like it, close the things down. I mean, where have we gone? I mean,
yeah, I mean, it's really scary. And, I think there is already what you can already see is a long-term consequence that will undermine the social fabric further. I mean, when I looked at the key fault lines in Brexit is usually rural versus cities, young versus old, and well-educated versus poorly educated.
Yes.
But they have one thing in common that is mostly overlooked, which is we're talking broadly about the net taxpayers and the net tax recipients. And the whole welfare state is based on tax transfers in the UK.
Right.
So, and come Brexit actually hurting the people who are effectively paying for
Absolutely. Well, the young and immigrants are basically paying the taxes to fund the old who voted for Brexit. And at some point, the young are going to go. I mean, the other thing you might think is places like Germany think, there's all these young people and Germany needs young people like there's no tomorrow. So Germany says, right, all these young people in Britain who've got all these college loans and they're really unhappy, maybe we should just make a separate deal individually and go get them. Come to Germany. And we need young people like you. Anyone with a college degree from the UK, don't be over there paying for these idiots. Come to Germany.
Well, I think
deals.
Well, I think that's already happening to a large extent, right? So,
of course, but the young are clearly going to be in a position where why should we pay for the people who tried to take away our rights to go and live and work in Berlin or Paris? Yeah. Right? If you're on your own, you pay for yourself.
And exactly, and even if they stay, the policy preference will shift towards, why should you increase pensions, right?
So, well, hang on, but it's not just that. It's why should you increase pensions? But at the same time, you impose fees on us to go to college that you didn't impose on yourself. So you impose the fees on us, and then you kept our pensions in real terms positive. I mean, the UK, in the last decade, households headed by an old age pensioner have had positive income growth. Everybody else has had negative income growth. And your point of the social fabric breaking down is clearly, we've set up intergenerational warfare. The other group, of course, who are paying for this has been the immigrants, especially from Eastern Europe, who've come, been very mobile, paid their taxes, had very high employment rates, and now folks like you are leaving. I mean, you don't take benefits, you contribute to the system, and now you've discouraged the young, but you've also discouraged immigrants who are the ones paying your pensions. This does not end well.
Yeah, no, I mean, and this was actually down to, I think, Theresa May. I had a letter published in the FT the week after the referendum, basically making this point. A lot of people are there not because you have to be there. That was the wrong assumption, but because you want to live in a place like London, right? So you can literally do a lot of the work elsewhere.
Right. I mean, the other thing, in a sense, is that the public who voted for Brexit mixed up what was happening with immigrants and what was happening with austerity. I mean, essentially what happened with the flow of Polish immigrants was that they disproportionately paid more money into the system than they took out. So they were living and working in the UK. Hence, they were entitled to put their kids in school and go to the hospitals. But what happened was the Central Exchequer took the money that they paid in for those services. And because of austerity, they didn't build the schools, they didn't build the hospitals. So now the system's overrun. But that wasn't the fault of the tax-paying, mobile Polish plumber who was working 80 hours a week, keeping the price of plumbing down. It was the fault of the austerity. And people got mixed up between austerity and basically contributing migrants.
Absolutely. And obviously, the two arguments couldn't be true at the same time. Either you're taking the jobs away or you are a drag on a social system. So what is it? It cannot be both at the same time.
Well, I mean, think of in a sense, as a labour economist, I think of this flow of highly skilled English-speaking mobile workers as greasing the wheels of the labour market. I mean, just makes the economy work better. And I mean, that's the reality. Now, maybe people are unhappy about the fact that these folks are there, but when they leave, output will fall, because now what you've done is you've rusted the wheels of the labour market. They're leaving, they're going away, they're not attracted to be there anymore. The pound falls because of Brexit. Now it's not such an attractive place to come and work. Therefore, everybody loses. So you voted for something. It's like you. It's the shortest suicide note of any country ever written ever. It's a self-inflicted recession by choice.
Well, Danny, on this happy note, I think this is all we have time for today. I mean, this obviously calls for another podcast in a year's time or so to
see how we've done. Absolutely.
To review where we are. Brexit might have happened by then. Who knows? Okay. Thank you very much indeed.
Then, of course, what's coming, I think the other thing which is interesting is I think there's going to be a recession in the US by middle of 2020, which is going to have very big implications for
the elections.
Election in November 2020. I mean, so that in a sense is so crucial for Trump, why Trump has to try and argue that interest rates has to be cut, because I think the sense is that the US economy is slowing.
So maybe we should wait until the next presidential election in the United States and then take stock.
One at the end of the year, then we do one at the end after the next election.
Absolutely. Danny, thank you very much for taking the time today.
Take care. Bye.
Thank you very much for listening. We hope you enjoyed it. Make sure you don't miss future episodes by subscribing to Social Europe Podcast. You can also read our articles on www.socialeurope.eu and follow us on Facebook and on Twitter @Social Europe. Until next time.